For a few years in the 1970s, the Mr. Asia syndicate made millions.
Heroin creates its own market. It acts like a form of plague.
Until jealousy, betrayal and murder brought it all crashing down.
Clark would have threatened him. Go and kill him. If you don't, I'm going to kill you and your wife and your son.
This is Mr. Asia, A Forgotten History. Listen to episode 4 now on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcast.
You're listening to the Weekend Sport Podcast with Jason Pine from News Talk ZB.
So the Chiefs this week confirmed that head coach Clayton McMillan will join Irish club Munster. He's being released from his contract a year early and will depart after this current season to take over at the Irish club. It'll bring to an end 5 seasons in charge at the Chiefs, during which Clayton McMillan has led them to the last 2 Super Rugby finals. He's also coached the New Zealand under-20s, the Māori All Blacks, New Zealand Barbarians and the All Blacks 15. He has signed with Munster until the end of 2028 and will link up with his new club in July. To discuss this, let's bring in New Zealand Rugby's General Manager of Professional Rugby, Chris Landrum. Chris, thanks for chatting to us. First of all, how did this conversation with Clayton play out as he sought a release from the final year of his contract with you?
Sure, Piney. Nice to be with you again. Yeah, it was big news earlier in the week, wasn't it? Clayton and New Zealand Rugby, together with the Chiefs, have always had a really strong relationship. We rate Clayton incredibly highly, not just as a coach, but as a person. True to form, Clayton has been really open and honest with us for some time now about the fact that he saw his next coaching position being offshore for a variety of reasons. And he let us know immediately, really, when this approach came from Munster to him. We've been discussing that for a few weeks, and those discussions led to the announcement yesterday.
How do you balance the two things, losing our top coaches, but also the desire to allow them to gain international experience and develop themselves as coaches?
Great question, and this is a really good example of that. It's very individualised. There's no one pathway in coaching. It's a really hard career. Coaches tend to move around a lot. It can be hard on family and whānau. In this case, we of course would have loved to have had Clayton, and the Chiefs are on record as saying this as well. We would have loved to have had him collectively in New Zealand in 2026, but we knew that would be his last year. In this case, I would rate Munster as one of the top half dozen or so club coaching opportunities in the world. It's a province with a proud rugby history, great links to New Zealand. They feature prominently traditionally in European competitions, play a lot of knockout rugby, that sort of thing. And in this case, we felt collectively that the Chiefs have good succession options available to them, who could be ready to coach earlier than 2027. So all of those things go in the mix, and I think you can see there in my comments around the club Munster, or the province Munster, and the comments about the club, the Chiefs, that there's quite a lot that's individual to this case of Clayton's.
Indeed. I want to talk a bit more about the succession planning side of this in a moment, but do you think ambitious coaches in New Zealand feel that they have to work overseas to enhance their prospects for a role with the All Blacks?
I hope not. As I said, there's no one pathway, and if you look at the last 2 appointments as All Blacks head coach, and Ian Foster and Scott Robertson, neither of them had direct international coaching experience, I guess, or coaching experience where they had been based offshore. They all had a range of experiences, and Ian, of course, had coached been involved in coaching many international test matches before he ascended to the All Blacks head coach position. Scott played a lot overseas, coached Barbarians rugby, is a student of the game, and so I hope not. But yet, there are also plenty of examples where people have gone overseas and returned to coach in New Zealand and up to the All Black level. And the obvious example that people will go to, which is a very successful period in All Blacks history, was the period of Graham Henry and Steve Hansen and Wayne Smith, who all had international coaching experience before they came back. I think the key thing for people to understand is, in the right circumstances, coaching overseas is never going to be a negative. You will get experiences of playing and coaching against different oppositions that play different style of game, different conditions, different levels of physicality, and that can only enhance you as a coach. So it's one pathway, but it's definitely not the only pathway. In Clayton's case, he's sitting here looking at the end of 2025. He will absolutely aspire to one day coach the All Blacks. That pathway is closed at the moment. There's only one All Blacks team and one All Blacks head coach role. So, I think people sitting back and understanding all of that landscape will really understand the decision that he's arrived at. And we certainly understood it as well.
How do you show aspiring coaches in New Zealand the pathway to the All Blacks? Because, as you say, there's only one job. That pathway is closed at the moment until at least the back end of 2027, and who knows beyond that. How do you show our top coaches an aspirational pathway to the job, let's be honest, Chris, that they all want?
Well, there are other Team in Black opportunities for our coaches. Now, you look at Clayton, and is a good example again. He has coached Maori All Blacks, he's coached at under-20s level, he's coached New Zealand Barbarians, and most recently he's been involved in coaching and has been head coach of the All Blacks 15. So there's a whole lot of pathway programs there, and special purpose teams like Maori All Blacks that do enable coaches to get more experience and to feel perhaps even closer to New Zealand rugby, to understand where they may sit. The reality is that the full-time head coaching roles that exist outside of the All Blacks exist at Super Rugby level. And what we tend to see is that coaches love coaching at Super Rugby level for a number of years, but it's unlikely to be a role that a coach will sit in for 10 or 15 or 20 years. And so that's where the international side does come in. But we do a lot. We work really closely with these coaches, Pioneer. All the Super Rugby head coaches are actually employees of New Zealand Rugby. We're involved in all of their development conversations. We see them regularly and talk to them about what they're seeing, not just in the game and around what we're doing and how we're playing, but also how they see their own future. So again, the pathway as a concept, it can be very individualised. There's lots of specific factors that go into any one individual coach's pathway or perception of it. And we're just part of that conversation, supporting them in their growth and their development.
Do you worry that if we use Clayton as an example, he's travelling his pathway, and as you say, he, I'm sure, at one stage would like that pathway to include coaching the All Blacks. Do you worry that he'll find a fork in the road that will send him off in a different direction, and he'll end up coaching the Wallabies or Scotland or someone like that?
I don't worry about it. I think it's just a reality for us. You and your listeners will know how many New Zealanders have coached other international sides, and I see that as a great strength for New Zealand rugby. Look at Jamie Joseph. Jamie had a fork in his road. He did his time at the Highlanders. He was highly successful in the final analysis there. He's then been coaching Japan for 8 seasons, and look where he is now. And look at how the Highlanders played last week. I was down in Dunedin, and all credit to the players, obviously, but to me, that team had Jamie Joseph's stamp all over it. And that's fantastic, because he's going to come back and he will, and his coaching group down there in the club will grow All Blacks for us. And all of his experience that he's picked up offshore will help him lead that program. So part of it's just the reality. We do only have one All Blacks head coach role, and we have one set of All Blacks assistant coaching roles, and we, fortunately enough, produce surplus talent. That means that not everybody can be satisfied immediately by moving into those roles, and they're highly, highly competitive. I think that's the standard we want for the All Blacks. While some coaches are applying their trade and growing in New Zealand, others will be applying their trade and growing offshore. And in the end, I'm comfortable that the vast majority of those people are motivated to want to coach the All Blacks as a priority, and when the time is right for them, they will put their hat in the ring.
Just on succession planning, Chris, I know that there's no heir apparent to Scott Robertson. It doesn't work that way. But what about at super level, where you've got 5 franchises, and we've had this week Clayton McMillan move on. Have you got a spreadsheet or a whiteboard or something that's perhaps just in your mind of the next potential candidates for each of the Super Rugby sides, for example?
Between us and our 5 clubs, we do. Sometimes the succession is more obvious than others. Sometimes we need to go to recruitment processes. But absolutely, you're always thinking about that. And the pathway into those roles is also or can be quite individualised. There is a growing distinction in coaching between what it takes to be a head coach and what it takes to be a great assistant coach. And it is not always the case that assistant coaches who do a lot of the delivery on and off the training field in our teams either will make good head coaches or even want to be head coaches. So sometimes from the outside, the obvious succession, people might think, well, okay, we'll just promote the assistant coach up to the head coach role. Sometimes that's not the case. And so we're always thinking coaching is a critical part of what we hope will be our competitive advantage in New Zealand rugby. It's always been a big part of who we are. We do populate other countries' programs with our coaches, and absolutely, basically, is the one-word answer to all of that, I suppose.
Indeed. And as far as the recruitment of a replacement for Clayton, the process around that, as you say, these coaches are employees of New Zealand Rugby, but clearly there's a vested interest around the Chiefs franchise in this case. So do you work together with the Chiefs? Is that how it works to come up with Clayton's replacement?
Yes, that's absolutely how it works. we'll be very aligned with the club. As I say, technically, the head coach of the Chiefs will be a New Zealand Rugby employee, but you absolutely have to make sure that the coach is set up for success locally, and that the club is aligned and supportive of that candidate, and can build a team around that candidate, which is their responsibility. So I've got no doubt that we're very aligned with the Chiefs. They're a really strong club. They're well led. They work hard in the high performance space, both in player and coach development. And when we get to that point later in the year, it'll be a really good conversation with them.
Just to finish, what does your gut tell you? Do you expect Clayton will coach in New Zealand again?
I do expect he'll coach in New Zealand again. I don't know at what level or in what role. That's part of the fun of all of this and part of his challenge. I expect him to do a really good job at Munster. I think the fit there for what I understand that province needs at the moment, and Clayton's skill sets is excellent. And he's still young. He's still got a big coaching career ahead of him if he wants it. And he knows we would love to see him back in New Zealand. And in what role is in the lap of the gods, as they say, Piney.
Indeed it is. Thanks for wrapping so much context around this for us, Chris. Really appreciate your time this afternoon.
Always a pleasure, mate. Thanks.
No, thank you, Chris. Chris Landrum there, head of the professional game, or New Zealand Rugby's general manager of professional rugby. Lots to unpack there, lots to get stuck into. You've had the chance to think about this news since it broke on Thursday morning. You've heard from Chris Landrum.
For more from Weekend Sport with Jason Pine, listen live to News Talk ZB weekends from midday, or follow the podcast on iHeartRadio.